Well, hello, everybody. This is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine, and this is your Rattlecast for Tuesday, February 4th. We have a great show, as always. Michael T. Young is here from New Jersey, is our featured poet. He's had poems in the current issue of Rattle, as well as two others, and we'll talk to him about his new book and all sorts of things. But first, let me say, Rattle's a publication of the Rattle Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit working to promote the practice of poetry. We've been publishing since 1995 and are unaffiliated with any other organization. We'd like to start out with a warm-up poem, and I forgot to put a warm-up poem up today. So I hit the random button, which is something, it's a WordPress plugin that Robert Peake wrote for me. So we could have random poems up, and now it's a pretty popular WordPress plugin, I guess, across the board. So I hit that old random button, and what came up but this poem here, Jane's Heartbreak Yard Sale by Lytton Bell. So let's warm up with that. Lytton Bell is, I don't know where she lives. We published her one time in this poem. She's the author of 3 books, though, most recently Nectar, and you can find them all on Amazon. Here's Lytton Bell's poem, Jane's Heartbreak Yard Sale, to get us started.
Jane's Heartbreak Yard Sale. Who sells used sex toys at a garage sale? I knew I had to pull over as soon as I saw that table full of dildos just to hear this woman's story. A whole bed was for sale, and a claw-footed bathtub, a motorcycle, a large stack of books, lingerie, and 10 photo albums. Photo albums? Leafing through, I could see that they were all happy couple love photos. Their trip to Hawaii, backpacking through Europe, mountain climbing in Tibet. And I shouldn't forget to mention all of the love notes. 3 huge cardboard boxes full of them. I picked one up. I stood outside your window for hours last night while you were sleeping, hoping you would feel me there and pull open the curtains. I approached her as she sat by the cash box, wearing a pair of oversized pink sunglasses. "So, this is everything he ever gave you?" I asked her, trying to be nonchalant. She nodded. "I was going to light it all on fire," she told me, "but what's the point?" "True," I replied, not sure what else to say. She seemed so peaceful about it, almost happy. Just then I noticed a pile of CDs. Jane's Joyride mix, Jane's Taking a Bath mix for Jane for when she's feeling a little blue, and one called In Case of an Emergency, I Love You. It was sealed with yellow caution tape and had obviously never been opened. "Can I buy this?" I asked her. $3.50, she said. I gave her the money and put the CD in my car and cried and could not open it.
So that was Lytton Bell with her poem, Jane's Heartbreak Yard Sale. It's nice to know that we have a dildo on the show already. That didn't take long. Okay, so let's move on to our featured poet today. As I mentioned before, Michael T. Young is a poet living in New Jersey, and his most recent book here, which I'll put up on screen really quick, is this really beautiful cover. Actually, I was reading this book like I always do at my son's jiu-jitsu class, and as he was getting his little water break or air break if you forget to bring water, which is equally important according to our jiu-jitsu master, he saw this cover and it really caught his attention, and he stared at it and said, "What the heck is going on there?" And so I showed him the book a little bit. And this is The Infinite Doctrine of Water by Michael T. Young. Just read his bio really quick. Michael T. Young, this is his 3rd full-length collection. The Infinite Doctrine of Water was published by Terrapin Books. He's also got a chapbook, Living in the Counterpoint, by Finishing Line Press, which received the 2014 Jean Pedrick Chapbook Award from the New England Poetry Club. His other collections include The Beautiful Moment of Being Lost, Transcriptions of Daylight, and Because the Wind Has Questions. You can find more information on him at michaeltyoung.com, which sounds exactly, or spelled exactly like it sounds. He lives with his wife and children in Jersey City, New Jersey, and works in Manhattan, I think. So that might be something interesting to talk about too. But here he is, Michael T. Young. Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So, so you live in New York City, right? Or you live in New Jersey, work in New York City?
Correct. I live in Jersey City, right across the street from Manhattan.
Awesome.
And
That's really, I mean, one of my favorite places to go. Alan used to have an apartment there, so we used to be able to take advantage and stop by kind of anytime we could, get in the area. It was really cool.
Where in Manhattan?
Oh, near Central Park, like sort of, I don't know, like 3-4 blocks away, south of Central Park.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's a good area.
Not bad. So do you want to start us out with a poem, then we'll talk some? And I should say before we do that if anybody has any questions for Michael T. Young, use the chat window on YouTube, and I'll pass any questions or comments along for him. Let's see, we got 14 people watching live right now, and people are trickling in. Do please click the like button too and share wherever you're listening to this, either now or later. That's always really helpful. Helps get us in the algorithms and let these kind of shows and podcasts be shared around the internet. And that's always a good thing because we need more poetry in this world. So, Michael T. Young, let's start us out with a poem.
Okay. I'm going to start off right at the beginning of the book, actually, page 7 with the first poem, which is Advice from a Bat. Advice from a bat. Hunt only at night. Fly erratically. Defy even your own expectations. Beetles, moths and mosquitoes, whatever is small and annoying. Cultivate the myths about you until every predator fears your legend. When hunting, be guided by a language only you can hear. The same is true when courting the one you love. Clean fangs and fur nightly. Crawl or climb to confuse the observant. Retreat to a cave no one believes in. Let the day and the world pass while you sleep, and sleep upside down, ready to wake and fall into flight.
Thank you. Again, that was Advice from a Bat by Michael T. Young from his most recent book, The Infinite Doctrine of Water. And that's a good poem to start with, actually, because I wanted to know that line. What was the line? It was retreat to a cave no one believes in. That line really sung to me and stuck out. And I really wondered what you sort of had in mind when you wrote that line. A cave that no one believes in it is such an interesting twist. So what is the cave that no one believes in?
It was one of those moments where the poem itself started. When you start off in a poem with something that anchors you, like an image or something you see, or a word that you heard, and then at some point it starts vaulting off into, other regions. Things that your imagination starts connecting to. And that was really where I felt it taking off for me toward the end there. I started thinking about the idea, the fear we have of bats, which is sort of irrational in a way because most bats are fruit bats and things like that, not vampire bats. And just the idea of this, how we've turned it into this mythical figure, and it's something, in that vaulting, that moment when we leap with our imagination towards something bigger, there's something, we're trying to go beyond a little bit what we know, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe even a little bit beyond what we presently believe. We're trying to see past it. And all of that was sort of compacted into that line for me when I wrote it. And a lot of it was just a reaching mm-hmm. for that in a way, if that makes sense.
No, that really does. I think that's what we talk about on this podcast all the time, but that's what poetry is really trying to do, is to articulate the things that you know but don't know and know somehow in your heart but don't understand. And I think I really feel like when it works, what's happening is that the poet sort of reaches to some kind of collective subconscious thing that exists in the universe, some kind of connection. And it ends up being like your subconscious talking directly for a moment to my subconscious. It doesn't usually have, doesn't have access to the linguistic systems of our brain, right? So it's cool when a line jumps out like that, and that's the line for you that really spoke in the poem too. And I don't know, there's something about that line that I just loved, and I kept sort of pondering that as I was reading the rest of the poems in the book. So it's a good first poem to start with.
What's also interesting about that is one of the reviews that was written for it read that poem as a kind of ars poetica.
Yeah.
And looked at the rest of the collection in light of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I don't know if maybe I got that from reading one of the reviews. I don't know if it was on the back. But I was wondering if you meant, and I was kind of hoping that it meant more than that to you, because it means more than that to me. Like, there's a lot more to the cave that no one believes in than just like the cave of poetry, I mean, but you could really easily read it as a statement about how, poetry is marginalized or whatever within our culture. But I think there's a lot more to it than that, for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's the thing. And that's a part of that leap out towards something a little bit more than we presently know. And you really, I mean, you can't articulate that except that's really what art is about in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that I think stumps, at least for me, the question of, well, what does that mean? I'm like, well, it means exactly what it says. There's a wonderful anecdote about Sibelius he had a symphony on album, and he played it for a friend of his, and his friend, after it was over, said, well, what does that mean? And Sibelius's response was to get up and put it back on.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
Yeah. I mean, if we could articulate it, we wouldn't need the poem. That's just why That's what real art does. Whether it's a painting that speaks to something in a certain way, or a poem, or any kind of art. If it's art, it speaks to something that you can't articulate. Which is why I think that most people aren't. Speaking of the cave, though, I mean, if you did use that as a metaphor for poets in their cave, it's the reason why more people aren't in the cave is because, confronting things that you don't quite know and understand is a little frightening for people a lot of the time, and it's not a pleasure, It's right. Something different. I don't know. It's like a extreme sport of the mind or something.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hence the talk of taking risk in art or being courageous in art.
Yeah. It really matters.
I mean, there are those poems you wind up writing and you're almost afraid to recite them in public.
Yeah. Do you have any of those in the book?
Not in this book. I'm happy I can recite all of these without hesitation. But I've been writing some of those poems lately.
Oh, wow, yeah. Okay, well, do you want to read maybe like two more from the book, and then we'll talk a little more?
Sure. The next one I'm going to do is Bioluminescence, which is on page 15. This poem was actually inspired by a photo of my wife, and taken by a friend out in Colorado when we were visiting, and it led into this poem, Bioluminescence. Old philosophers would call this look melancholia, but I see in this photo of my wife thinking, weathers of competing beauty, someone who can be in two places at once, there on the couch, leaning into the cushion folds, and somewhere else, focused on the unseen, beyond the clock's exhausting rap, working an idea like dough into the necessary bread. All moments of clarity narrow like this, the periphery dimmed as in a Rembrandt, his philosopher in meditation sitting in a shaft of light as if at the bottom of a well, because the profound leads into dark places, like the ocean floor, where the only illumination comes from the bodies of fish swimming through its miles of perpetual night.
Yeah, we'll do another poem really quick, but just to jump in and say, it's so strange to see this poem, because our prompt poem this week is about the fang tooth from one of the deep sea fish. So we have at the open mic at the end,
I remember
we have a whole bunch of poems that this would fit pretty well with. So it's a good, and really the Infinite Doctrine of Water is such a strange coincidence that we did this book, because there are a whole bunch of deep sea imagery throughout the book, and water is central to everything. So there's a cool coincidence that happened today. So tune in for the open mic later. But anyway, keep going. Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's okay. The next one is called Study for Infatuation, which is on page 21. Study for Infatuation. Sometimes the blue sky threatens. The lilac conceals some danger. But it passes like a cougar, stalking among the boulders, and deciding mysteriously to move on. You don't know, but something you did or didn't do saved your life. And what might have happened had you turned your back on this sunset, this rotting fence post, this dandelion dripping its yellow into the cracks along the gutter? Something seamlessly escapes, and you can't follow. In the loam and marrow, its tracks evaporate like water, and like water, when again it dashes a flirtatious spindrift before you, it will mass, a cloud over trees, seeming fresh with such an allure, shading the street, an enticement of flight and melody. It will play in the mind like an etude, strength to endure the long, beautiful devouring.
That was Study for Infatuation from The Infinite Doctrine of Water, Michael T. Young's newest book. So, Michael, let's talk a little bit about your journey into poetry, because you work. I can't remember the name of the company, but it's one of the big four accounting business firms. So it's interesting, like Wallace Stevens and many others who had jobs, in the business sector. How did you end up being a poet too? Or were you a poet first and then left, or did you, how'd that work?
Yeah, I've been writing poetry since since I'm 15. I was 15. I got into poetry actually oddly through martial arts, and because I started studying martial arts when I was around 11, but I also started reading philosophy about that time, and mostly reading things like the Tao Te Ching, Alan Watts, Krishnamurti, and people like that. And there's a lot of poetry in there. And around the age of 15, I injured my back, and my high school library teacher had given us an assignment to write a poem. And she just, after she read my poem, suggested, she said, "Did you ever think of being a writer?" And while my back was healing, I started writing, and then I never stopped. I didn't go back to martial arts. I decided to write instead. And so that is what I've been doing since then. And winding up at Deloitte was, I've been just doing administrative work since I left high school. So I started at the public library. Then when I moved to New York, I worked at various places like the American Bible Society, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, places like that, but always doing stuff that's similar to administrative work. Now I'm at Deloitte. So
do you think that frees you up, since you don't, during your day job, since you don't spend time focusing on poetry? We were talking last week with Kathleen Balma, who is a librarian, and she talked about how her other jobs, that didn't involve poetry, were sort of like a blessing, because she felt like poetry could be her sanctuary from the rest of her life rather than like the center. So she stayed in a place where it was like joyful and never felt like work. I'm putting words in her mouth maybe, but she said something like that. Do you feel that way? Do you think it's do you think it's sort of a better way to be a poet, to have a job that's not in poetry?
I think it is better. There's a part of me that fantasizes about being in academia, but I think that's probably because I've never been in it. And because I have friends who are in it, and I know it's very difficult for them. I know, how hard it is to, get jobs and keep jobs and, make enough money and things like that. And the competition is awfully hard. I mean, there's, a minuscule number of jobs for a huge field of very talented people. And, I don't really I don't really think about that. And that I think is helpful. I don't have to worry about that or be concerned about it. I can just write about what I want. I don't have to publish in order to keep my job. I can publish when I want to, hold off when I want to. Because a lot of times, I mean, even, like after putting a book out, a lot of times I like to just pull back and not think about another book. I like to just write a poem after poem because something strikes me. And I think I have more freedom to do that. And I don't have to worry about grading papers or what the next term is going to be and what we're going to be studying. I can study whatever I want at the time, and I enjoy doing that too. Just sort of thinking, I get on binges and I want to read certain types of writing or certain people or do certain things. And I don't have to worry about being pulled away from that because of other obligations where I have to do a syllabus and now I have to reread this stuff for the class so that I'm prepared for teaching. I can read whatever I want. And I like that.
Do you think about poetry during the day, during the workday, or is it sort of firewalled off where you when you get home and on the commute, that's when you turn your attention?
A lot of times it's on my way home. That's usually when I'm thinking about, I usually read on my way home. I'll start contemplating maybe an image or something like that. I do have time during my day because of my lunch breaks. I get an hour. So a lot of times I use that time to either work on poems, work on essays or reviews, send things out. So my hour lunches are, I guard them very closely. But that's when I get a lot of that done. And every once in a while, there might be a slow time at work that maybe I'll jot something down here or there. I write a note down for what has to be done, and then I write a line, and then I write another note what has to be done. But most of it's my lunchtime and my time home, or maybe a few minutes before I fall asleep. I've had that happen where I'll get something right before I'm about to fall asleep, and I boot my computer up and dash something off, and then get to revise it through the week. So those are the primary ways that I get things
it's one
done.
of those things where I sort of glamorize it in my head. Like it feels like the perfect way to engage with poetry, but I know I'm sort of over glamorizing it. But you mentioned, not having to worry about what you write, but having a job in the corporate world. Do you worry about writing something that messes with your day job? I mean, like, poets have a public platform for their opinions and Googleable all the time for things, and things can be misunderstood. And
Right.
Do you worry about your supervisors reading a poem that you wrote and not agreeing with it somehow, or anything like that, or is that not something that comes into play?
No, I don't. I don't think any supervisors read poetry. For most people don't read poetry.
That's true. Well,
If one of my supervisors said, "Hey, I read your poem yesterday," I'd be like, "Really?"
Yeah.
I'd be shocked.
Yeah. Well, look, thinking back, we've had a few people who asked us to delete poems because they were worried about their employment, situations. They were all teachers. There's not a single, it's like 4 or 5, maybe 4 people who have done that over the years.
Right.
And it's stuff that like their students found it and then told their parents, and then it was something that they didn't want their,
Right.
principal at the school to know about or something. So they asked if I could delete a poem from the website, which only happens with teachers, I think. So no one from...
See that being
Yeah. Like a lot of times we don't think about what we're writing, and you write about, like, especially if you're a teacher, for kids, if you're writing about like sex, then, parents get upset about that if they find Mrs. Hannigan or whatever is writing about her, all that kind of stuff. So it is something that you kind of have to think about in certain positions, but luckily not yours, I guess.
No, and I know high school teachers who are poets that publish, and I imagine they might have to think about it every once in a while. But feel no concern about that because I don't think anybody's looking.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, let's touch on that topic a little bit. But why don't more people read poetry? Yeah, yeah.
In general, that might just come down to why many people really. I don't think we have a culture that reads or is encouraged to read. Sadly, I think we just don't. I don't think we teach people to see it as a pleasure, as something enjoyable. We see learning and reading as something we have to do to maybe get a job. Learn this and get a job. Read a manual or whatever have you, rather than engaging the imagination as being this thing we do for fun. And maybe if we could get people to see that engaging their imagination is fun, people might read more. They might want to engage those things.
If it was seen as an adventure, I think, which is what it is. It's a mental adventure. Well, we got a great question from Mickey Blankish, which I'm going to get to, but I want you to read two poems first to sort of shift back to poetry.
Okay. Let's see. What's the next one? The next one this is on page 25, and it's called Sage. None of my dictionaries define it as a color, and yet my wife tells me it's the color of our wedding, her dress, my tie. I take her word for it, but feel no wiser. I sometimes find it in the tiles of some mosaic, or fired into a mug now on clearance at the store, and I'm suddenly connected, rooted, though it depends on the light, as color always does, changing with air densities and angles, shifting with the hours, aging, like the plant that is this color's namesake, its leaves like fingers pointing in every direction, as if it knew something. And I guess the next one, I'm going to read is The Generosity of the Past. And this starts on page 28. The Generosity of the Past. In our apartment, there was always light, splitting through the windows like mercy, illuminating bookshelves and what we thought, our conversations or our glasses of wine, lifted to toast each day of generosity, the quantity surpassing what we knew. We read our books, discussed the world we knew, interpretations shifting with the light. We lived by an aesthetic of generosity, art and music painting our world with mercy, although diluted by several bottles of wine, and so reduced to memory and thought. Sediment in the bottles was like a thought, a remnant of the past and all we knew. Nights listening to Liszt or tasting wine, arguing over how things changed with light, how sometimes saying nothing was like mercy, was a generosity. The simplest things are forms of generosity, like paying bills, or making tea with thought for how you like it, sugar, a little mercy. We knew that once, but then forgot we knew. So when we changed, we blamed the changing light and turned to vinegar like aging wine. But then we'd drink just anything, old wine, bad scotch, tequila, though generosity, a generosity that took no delight, not in our books, not in a word or thought. We toasted to the past and what we knew, began the long goodbyes with little mercy. If time allowed us to forgive, that's mercy. And I recall with every glass of wine, because it's who I am and what I knew, and I am thankful for the generosity of that time, for its store of meaning and thought, which are to me here now a kind of light, for it's a light that makes a spectrum of mercy, colorful thoughts as deep and rich as wine, a generosity that's always new.
That was The Generosity of the Past by Michael T. Young, a sestina, if you're wondering at home.
Correct.
From The Infinite Doctrine of Water. So let's see. So I had a question. I wanted to read your note from the poem that we published today. We just shared it as a back issue Tuesday feature. But you said writing poetry is the slow process of thinking clearly, of connecting seemingly disparate elements in the progress toward meaning. Every day is filled with vertiginous moments about to break into such odd but true realizations. Taking time to realize those insights and articulate them in a poem is not only a pleasure, but a necessity. And I want to talk about that vertiginous moments a little bit. The poems sort of feel very, I don't want to say like Whitman-esque, but there's sort of a nature poetry vibe where you're noticing things as you pass through the sort of landscape of your life. Even though it's New York City, so it's not like a nature, but it's human nature, I mean, it's scenes and, bridges and the Hudson River. Do you find that you get inspired that way as you pass through New York City? Is that a central theme for you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, as I said, there are a lot of times when I'm coming home from work, and that's when I'll start getting images or thoughts about things, and I'll jot them in the book I'm reading or somewhere else, and get them onto the computer when I get home. So there are times when just various moments when I'm walking through the city or I'm just walking around my neighborhood. I mean, one of the poems in the collection is The Reservoir, and the reservoir that inspired that is just down the block. And a lot of times, that particular one, one of my favorite collections is Rilke's new poems. And Rilke got his ideas for the new poems walking around Paris, just jotting down ideas and subjects. And a lot of times I'll think about that and I'll just start looking around me and looking for subjects and what I'm noticing. And that's how I start jotting notes down toward things. So yeah, that does happen a lot for me.
Do you ever just say, I want to write a poem today, and you sit down in front of a blank page with no image to start with it? Does that happen too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think poets should be able to sit down and work at it. I forget what it was, but it was actually on a Facebook conversation with a wonderful poet, and he Alfred Korn, he posts some questions sometimes, and he said, well, how did that go? When I was a young poet, when I was a young writer or a young poet, I thought that now that I'm older, I know this. And my thought was that, when I was younger, I thought inspiration led to work. And I said, now that I'm older, I know that work leads to inspiration.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that's what we need to do. If you ever look at the writing habits of a lot of the poets we really admire, like W.H. Auden or Joseph Brodsky or James Merrill, these guys had hours that they got up in the morning and they wrote for a certain number of hours, and then they went out and did other things for the day. So they treated it like a job. And I think that's a very important lesson. They're not sitting around waiting to be struck by lightning.
Yeah.
They're going out looking for it. They go out and get a lightning rod, and they go out in the storm, and they stand there like this, and they get it to work.
Yeah. That's a quote by who's that by? Who says like a poet is somebody who goes out in the rain and gets struck by lightning, and a great poet is somebody who gets struck three. Yeah, Randall Jarrell. Yeah,
it was Randall Jarrell, and a poet named Charles Martin actually made a wonderful poem about it. I forget which collection it's in.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of ties in to what Mickey Blankish asked. She says, "I'm curious about your process. You have many excellent lines. Do they tend to build in order of the poem, or do you assemble them more in a collage fashion or some approach? Like, do you sort of scatter your thoughts around and then construct them, or do they come out linearly, I guess is another way to put that question?
I think it's different every time. Sometimes there is a collage effect, Like that poem that opens the collection, the Risk of Listening to Brahms. To me, it felt, and that's what led to me writing the quote that you have on the website, and about those disparate pieces coming together. That to me felt like this collage effect. There were these very different thoughts that I had, but they somehow connected, and I knew they connected. And so then I put them together. And then there are other times when it seems like something is a progression. You know, one thing leads to the next. But I do find it different all the time. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's a process of working at it. Each one to me is very different than the last one. And it's a process of finding out how this is going to work this time. You know, where are these pieces going, and how do they come together? So I think that's the process of learning to improve one's writing, to see what's working this time with these pieces and how they fit and how they progress.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, good answer. Why don't we read a few more poems?
Okay. The next one is the close reading. This is on page 37. This is one of my personal favorites in the collection. I used to read while nestled in a crook of maple branches, or seated on a slab of concrete that jutted into lake water, striders coasting the rumpled sheets. Reeds on the far shore needled the shallows, writing a subtext into palms of sunlight, alluding to trout and bass tunneling the deep, to the early alphabets of mud and rock. Mallards skirted the surface by day, by night, their wings scratching brief calligraphies into the water. There was always something to read, a word or glyph to decipher, Canada geese pausing in their long migrations, or a dead fish with pierced armor leaking his guts to the summer sun, to flies unzipping the air in busy gratitude, to those days when my idea of heaven was so big it contained even this. Apologize for this.
No, it's cool. We have no, when where I am, we're in a town of like maybe 3,000 actual people, and if there's a siren, it's like a headline news for the local Facebook page. Like, what was that siren? What's going on? So it's kind of fun to remember what it's like to live in an actual city. Do I see lights like right there? Is that right outside your window?
Oh yeah, they're going right by because the street that they're going by is right next to me. And so as the sirens go, as the lights go by,
that's dramatic. Yeah.
As long as there isn't a crash outside, which we have an intersection nearby, and unfortunately, it happens every once in a while. People don't pay attention to the lights enough.
Yeah. Why don't you do two more? Let's try to get. Yeah, I mean, you got a bunch of good poems here. Let's try to get through them all.
Okay. This one is called The Longest Hibernation. I once collected notebooks of runes and hieroglyphs, traced the evolving stages of Chinese from pictograms to ideograms, felt their swoops and curls under my hand, as if the pen were a key, about to unlock a cage, releasing some mythical bird, a kindled emissary, beating about the room, striking some fire, nesting habitably as the barns nested in the hills and farms of Ole. Their spotted hex signs, their haylofts thick with fodder and secrets molting in the rafters, all of it forked down the feeding holes to the cattle with the necessity of full disclosure and endurance. Or that's how it would turn out in our favorite stories, those that fed the slow progress to the better life, even then, in the 70s, when my Uncle Woody worked in a glass factory, could only say he had made domes for missile silos, but nothing more. All the details vitreous, greased, and in our best interest, like the Cold War, like the triple triangle on the school across the street, a sign, a symbol so blunt it was the opposite of shelter, a place to burrow down like an animal curling into a long hibernation, trying to sleep through the end of everything. Let's see. And this next one is called Seed. I prefer reading history in a flowering of dirt and cooked mud. The glittering text of macadam after rain, the squirrel's risky acrobatics in the mulberry, leaps from limb to telephone cables, the occasional fall and hard thud. The beauty of this daring makes a stage of my backyard, makes the page of a story printed in the very enactment, an image I carry with me, like a book of hours, or the stained glass panels of Sainte-Chapelle, telling the whole story from creation to the end of the world, in images and colors radiant with struggle.
And that was Seed from The Infinite Doctrine of Water. Let me ask sort of two questions sort of simultaneously. So Brian Guidi asks, is there a favorite poem that you have written, or are they all special in your own way? Why don't you just do that one first? Is there a special poem for you, or are they all sort of special? And if so, what makes that special poem special?
Well, I have a few that mean a lot to me for different reasons. And like the bioluminescence poem that I read earlier, that one means a lot to me because it's connected to a trip that my wife and I took out to Colorado to visit friends. And I have this image, in my head of my wife in that picture and the time we were out there. So sometimes, those kinds of associations become important. And that means a lot. The generosity of the past, one of the other poems I read, that's another one that connects to another time in my life that was very meaningful, and hence what the poem talks about. So I find a lot of different poems, have associations that are meaningful for different things. Some of the poems I'm writing now, like those poems that I was saying how I'm writing some that I'm almost afraid to recite in public. But some of those are connecting to things, from far back in my past, from when I was a child, and things that, I tried to articulate about various social issues, but in my own context, in my history. And so they're very meaningful in that respect, trying to look closer at what I understand about the nature of our culture and things like that. So a number of them, but all for different reasons.
Yeah.
The close reading poem is one of my favorites in this collection, but I like that because of the music in it. I'm very pleased with the sonic effects and the phonetics and the way the poems, the words relate to each other. I think it's one of the more successful poems in the collection myself.
Yeah. Thanks. So what I wanted to ask who some of your favorite poets are. And on a side note, are there any poems, you mentioned being in martial arts before, are there any poets who write about martial arts? Because my my son's jiu-jitsu teacher asked me just like last week if I had any books that I could suggest for him. The only one I could think of is Don Baird. I don't know if you know him. He's a haiku poet, and he owns a dojo in Los Angeles. But other than that, we had one poem about how a drunk at the bar. It's by what's his name? I'm drawing a blank on his name. But there's a poem in a couple issues ago about somebody who is a black belt poet, but he doesn't write about it that much. Are there any books of poetry about martial arts that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of any that are just about martial arts. I know there is a Villanelle. it makes me want to run to my
Uh-huh.
bookshelf because I can't remember the writer's last name. His first name is Jason, um, and it's in a collection that won an award, maybe like the Walt Whitman Award or something like that. But he wrote a villanelle, and it's about Bruce Lee and wanting to be like Bruce Lee, but it plays off of one art in a brilliant way. And I'll send that to you after the reading because it's a really fun poem. It's one of my favorite martial arts.
I'm curious to see that. So who are poets you read though? Like who do you like to read?
Oh boy. Lately, I spent a lot of time with Adrienne Rich last year, and I also reread Dickinson last year. I sort of go through various phases and things like that. Rich became very, excuse me, became very important to me, especially because of her ability to deal with political issues and social issues, both in her prose and in her poetry. And I sort of just dove very deeply into her poetry and her prose and spent a few months with it. Probably, well, that was maybe 2017, but then it spilled over into 2018 a little, and then I went back into it again last year. So I spent a lot of time with Rich. But some of my favorite poets, really, I mean, there's so many. For years, I loved Richard Wilbur's one of my favorites, W.S. Merwin, James Merrill, Elizabeth Bishop. Coming to more recent people, I really like Natasha Trethewey, Terrence Hayes. I spent a lot of time with, Stephen Dunn a while ago, Gerald Stern. I just got.
Oh, you're here. It works. Okay.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I still hear you and see you. So whatever it is, just don't touch anything. And if it doesn't work, if it drops, I'll call you back. So don't worry about that. But okay.
I just wanted to make sure. But that's for me. A lot of those poets, and I mean Seamus Heaney. I love the tactile quality of his poetry. There's so many wonderful poets. It's really hard to just identify a handful. I mean, I obsessed a lot about Milton when I was younger. When I was a teenager, I sort of spent about a year just preparing to read Paradise Lost, and then read Paradise Lost, and then reread it about 7 times, and then took a class in college on it. So that was like a big one for me. I spent a lot of time with Milton early on. And then there's Frost and Poe and,
there really are. Now, CB99 Videos asked a question, and that's, I'm trying to remember her name, but it's the person who lives on a houseboat. I remember that. But she asked a sort of very specific technical question. But she asked why in your poems, why do the titles have a sans serif font while the rest of the fonts are serif fonts? Which just brings up an interesting, I don't know. I have experience publishing one book. I've published other people's books with our chapbook series. With our chapbook series, there's the format set, and nobody can really change the inner layout. With Red Hen Press, that published my book, American Fractal, like 10 years ago, they just showed me a layout. I asked them if they could make an adjustment, and they did, and that's kind of all it was to it. How much say do you have in the design as a poet? You've been author of 3 books and 2 chapbooks, if I remember right, or just one chap? Oh, yeah, okay.
Correct.
So, and it's all with different presses too, I think. So how has your experience been different with each press, or is it sort of a standardized thing? And do you get to make choices like that about the serif and sans serif fonts?
All the presses I've worked with, I've had a lot of interaction and a lot of say in how things finally turn out, which I've always been happy about. I mean, like the cover, when you mentioned the cover, I mean, I got to pick that. I tracked it down and found it, and I was the one that put it in. But with that, it was just sort of a back and forth with Diane Lockwood, who's the one who runs Terrapin Press. She's a wonderful poet, and she has a newsletter and puts out craft books, and she runs Terrapin Press as well. And, there was a lot of back and forth on everything from, revisions to the poems, to how the cover looked, to the fonts being used and having a different font. I know we went through a process of specifically deciding there would be a different font for the titles. I can't remember the reasoning behind it, but it all made sense as we went along. And it was always mutually agreed upon. It was never, this is how it has to be in any particular direction. We always worked through making the decision together. And I've had that experience with almost every press.
Yeah, that's kind of how I imagine it, and that's my sense of it, is that it's very interactive, because these are small presses, and the marketing is going to be all you, and a lot of the choices are you. It's not like you're working with FSG and you have a team of people, imposing what's going to sell, because what sells is just probably the most important factor for how well a poetry book sells is how happy you are as a poet with it, because you're the main marketer. And if you're excited to be selling it and getting people to buy it, that's the thing that's going to get people to buy it. So I think it probably just falls naturally in that direction through economic ecosystems. But what's your experience been like in the publishing process in general? Because you've got those 3 books and 2 chapbooks. You've been published all over. Can you talk a little bit about the climb up the ladder to where you could publish 3 books of poetry? Were you struggling for a time? Were you like submitting things and getting them rejected? And what was there a time where you was there a time where you like sort of realized like I landed something that's successful and I can take this seriously? Or was there a moment for you that was like a big moment?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think to me it's just the commitment to, one, to the art itself. I really, there are very few things I enjoy more than the struggle of getting a poem right, and feeling, you have that, like Frost called the homesickness, that beginning of a poem, and getting to the point where you work at it, whether it's a week or 2 years or 13 years, and you get this poem right. That moment of knowing you got it, and there's a point when it seems like you got it, even if you can't articulate it. It's like, that's it. And I love that moment of realizing I got this thing that I was working toward right. When it comes to the movement of getting things published, to getting books published and put out there, I think if you're interested in putting together the work and putting the work into it, putting the poems and everything out into the world in different forms, first in journals, then in books or chapbooks, I think, or even in readings. I think that's all a part of the process. It's not you write a poem and then you publish a poem. It all becomes a part of a single process, which includes getting them rejected and getting them accepted, and eventually having enough to put together a book and figure out how it coheres, and finding a publisher for that, and then, promoting it. It all seems to be, to me, a whole part of just doing, putting it out into the world and saying, here are these poems. This is something that, has a particular vision, a way of articulating certain feelings and certain perceptions that might be helpful. And I don't think there's a moment where suddenly you make it and don't get rejected anymore, or that doesn't happen. I think that's,
well, I think it does, but but maybe
Carl Bennett said it didn't.
Really?
Even after I remember him making the statement even after winning the Pulitzer that he still gets rejections.
Yeah. Well, just the sense of indignation that some people have when I reject them, I kind of get the sense that they're not used to it. But that's a side topic.
And that's when I'd say, hey, wallpaper and rejections. And I used to literally do that when I lived in the village with all my artist friends, and that's when we didn't have computers where we just submitted everything through Submittable. I would get letters and I'd have a rejection slip and it would go on the wall. And my room was wallpapered in rejection slips. And my friends thought it was morbid. And I was like, no, I find it helpful. It sort of turned it into its own project. Trying to finish the wall.
Yeah. One of the things that I miss I haven't submitted poems in like over 10 years, but one of the things I miss is just that sense of possibility when stuff is out there. Absolutely. Just having poems out that you could, at the time, when I was submitting it was more over the mail still. But you could go to the post office and maybe there would be something cool there. And that's one of the things I really miss about submitting poems. Earlier you mentioned frost and homesickness, which is something I'm not familiar with. Can you explain what that means? Like he said something about homesickness? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, yeah. He talked about how a poem begins, and he said it begins as a homesickness. There are a few metaphors he uses, and maybe somebody will type it into the thread on the side. But one of them is he says it begins as a homesickness. This sense of longing to, maybe go somewhere, but you don't know where it is. I'm elaborating. That's not all. He just called it a homesickness, and it's just the germ, the beginning of what the poem is going to be.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It's something very easy to Google.
That's true.
Type frost and homesickness. I'm sure it'll come up.
Let's see. Jack Green asks if you could read The Risk of Listening to Brahms, but if you go to Rattle's website, you can listen to him read it there. So we're not going to do that tonight, but just go there. It's right on the homepage today. But you had 3 poems you wanted to close out with, so let's close out with those. I think we have time to just do all 3.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that, Jack.
No, Jack will enjoy it. Just
He's an old. The next poem I'm going to read is on page 66, and this is called Paperclip. And I will interject that the thing I say about Oxford here is true. It's something I found out and led to this poem. I learned that in an interview to enter Oxford, they might ask how you would describe infinity. And I thought about once being asked how I would describe a paperclip to an alien, that is, to someone who's never seen one. It was a writing exercise that made me think of how I would describe the autumn mountains where I grew up. And I decided that they are the color of whiskey and intoxication and exuberance, which might be a way of describing a paperclip. That is, a wire that's intoxicated, wandering in circles, swiveling on its heels as it makes its way out to meet friends that it embraces, holds together in a maudlin circle of endearment, all of which is also how I think of the infinite. And I'll read the last poem in the collection, which is called The Voice of Water. It sounds like grape leaves shaking. It cushions like thick grass underfoot. Its currents spread beyond the range of mountains, which is why sometimes people mistake it for the distant trickle of the sun setting. The error depends on which way they're walking, and if the wind is blowing from the north or south. It licks your fingers when you wave, and only by its tongue can you tell if the person you're greeting is a stranger or some distant uncle. Comforted by one of its many dialects, your neighbor grins from his porch, cigarette in hand. When it whispers with the same heaping hush of salt, pouring from an uncapped shaker. Because of its excesses, it remembers. Even after you've closed the book, it keeps reciting the lines. And yes, I was going to close with a poem that's not in the collection, one of my newer ones, which appears in the Valparaiso Poetry Review last year, around this time, I think, or maybe May. This poem is called Ways to Open. The door to my house is so blue. I think of it as an entrance to the sea. In its beveled window, reflected clouds swell white like an organ forming, a lung, alluvial, and spilling its breath of salt gems and spindrift. Waters splash off the frame, depositing on the door sill memories in the shape of shells, a sprinkling of sea glass. The blue sky beyond looms and reminds me there is a lock and somewhere a key. On clear days, I can remember that what I'm attempting is to find new ways to open.
Michael T. Young, thanks so much for sharing those poems with us. I remember back when I was in college, when I fell in love with poetry for the first time, I'd love to go to poetry readings because it made me feel like I want to read poems. Write poems, I should say. And like words that fly around in your brain, you know? And that's how I feel after reading or listening to your poem. So thanks so much. Hopefully everybody who's watching this now will go write a poem tonight. But yeah.
That was wonderful.
So Michael T. Young, thanks so much for joining us. I'll talk to you later. Yeah,
Thank you. Have a great night.
So that was Michael T. Young. His book, once again, his most recent, is hang on a second. Here we go. His most recent is The Infinite Doctrine of Water, and as you heard before, it's from Terrapin Books. And you can find more about Michael T. Young at his website, michaeltyoung.com. You can find links to all of his books, including this latest. He's also got a poem in the winter issue of Rattle. So check that out if you're a subscriber and enjoy another Michael T. Young poem. Now, we are moving on, for those watching on YouTube or Facebook on video, to the open mic portion of the night. As always, if you would like to join in, you can do it a number of ways. First of all, you can email poems to me at openmic@rattle.com. That's the quickest way to do it. But the preferred way, it's really fun to do if you have Skype. You can type in Rattle Poetry on Skype, send me a chat message, and I will call you back when the time is right over Skype, and then we can do a video poem like Michael was just doing. So that's always a lot of fun. You could also give me a call at 818-850-7727. That's 818-850-7727. It's on the screen there. And if you call me and the time is right, I'll just answer. If not, I will just let it ring. You know, you can just let it ring if you want. If you get tired of letting it ring, I will call you back in a minute or two when the time is right and we're done with whatever poem we're talking about. We have a new feature on the Rattlecast now, and it is a weekly prompt that Megan's writing. And a whole bunch of people wrote poems last week for last week's prompt. Let me put that on screen. Let's see. Here was last week's prompt. This was the nightmarish fangtooth. Among the deepest living fish ever discovered, you must avoid the words fish, sea, and ocean. And here on the screen now is the nightmarish fangtooth. Now, I have to pull up something. Hang on one second. I forgot to open up these audio files. Because actually a few people, we're going to read about 6 poems, I think, from here. A few people, one person sent audio, so I'm going to do her poem. Then we have one pre-recorded open mic poem, too. Let me just get these started really quick so they're ready to go. And hopefully the computer won't freeze because there's so many programs opened all at once. Let's see. Okay. So we're good to go when we get to M.L. Clark's poem. Now first, I'm going to try to write a poem every week. This week was brutal for me. You might not think that publishing a quarterly magazine comes with a lot of work, but oh, wow. I was up until 2 a.m. pretty much every night this week getting the spring issue in Chapbook, Falling Off the Empire State Building by Jimmy Pappas is the chapbook this spring. And the spring issues features Kim Adenizio, and so the proofreading and getting the files all prepared for the printer and all that stuff. The deadline was Monday, so I had very little sleep, but see, I'm making excuses. So I wrote a haiku really quick as I was taking the dog for a walk last night. And I meant to write more, but here's my haiku. I was walking the dog, and it was 15 degrees out last night up here in Southern California. You don't think it's cold, but it can be. And I was thinking about how the one thing I learned about a fangfish, looking it up, the fang-toothed fish, is that they have something called, what's it called? Let me think. It's vertical column migration, I think they call it. But every night, so many of the creatures of the ocean come up, and the Wikipedia page said they feed by starlight. And I thought that was a strange, imagining starlight penetrating the ocean is kind of impossible. So I'm not sure if that's true. And it turns out I looked into it a little bit more because I was curious, and that didn't make sense. And it's just because it's dark and they can avoid predators at that time of night, I think. Anyway, it was freezing cold. So here's my little haiku. I wrote this. I meant to write a longer poem in addition to this when I got back from my walk with the dog, but I fell asleep. So here's my little haiku. This is: feeding by starlight, even the fog tonight is fang-toothed. Feeding by starlight, even the fog tonight is fang-toothed. And that's my poem for my haiku for this week. Next week I'll write a longer one, I promise. I'm going to, like I said, I'm really in the mood to write after listening to these poems and having all the words bounce around my head. So from now on, I'm going to write the poem every Tuesday night. That's my new thing. I'm not going to wait till the night before. But Megan is a better poet than me. And it was her prompt, so it's kind of cheating, I think. But this was a genuine original poem based on it, and she's got a good one. Here's Megan's poem for the week, and she's going to write one too every week. And that way, all two of us and everybody watching here will have a reason to stay on task and keep writing through our busy lives. That's the point of doing these prompts. So here's Megan's poem. This is Thalassophobia, which is the fear of the ocean. There's a really good poem that we published in Rattle, 15 years ago, called Thalassophobia, by Michael Gavin Frank. I think it's Michael Gavin Frank. Is that his name? You should check that out. That's a really good one too. But here is Megan's. Thalassophobia. In the movies, the psyche is a bottomless black pit. One floats, suspended in midair inside herself, screaming soundlessly, mouth round in a cartoon terror. We don't know what we are, mind or soul or bone, but we know it's endless, and there's nothing to grab as we fall. The deepest dive on record by a human is 129 meters. The longest recorded time without sleep is 11 days. Once a doctor with a face blank as a fog told me there's nothing wrong with you. It's in your head, like your head was an easy place to leave, like you could float up and climb onto the island of your body, where the ground is soft and sun-warmed. I saw this documentary about things that live, where even light is afraid to go. And there was this one, the fangtooth, that looks like a childhood nightmare, and they said it can reach waters 16,000 feet deep. And maybe you'll understand why my first thought was, I wonder if there's something even deeper than that. And that was Megan's poem, Thalassophobia. Megan's a great poet, which is one of the reasons I fell in love with her 15 years ago. We're trying to get her to write more. We've been doing that for 15 years, pretty much. So hopefully this will help. She's got a new prompt for this week. But let's do some other poems. Now, this next poem, we have the audio for. This is M.L. Clark, a poet we've published in Rattle 3 or 4 times over the years. And let me put that up for you. This is Fangtooth Fever Dream. And here is M.L. Clark reading it.
Hi, everyone. This is...
My name is M.L. Clark.
I am recording in Medellin, Colombia. I have lived here for 2 years now, and I would still not be surprised if I saw a creature like this suddenly darting between the trees on my own walk to work. Fangtooth Fever Dream. Without meaning to, you sympathize with its long arc of tooth, a menace of jaw protruding so steeply you ache for the creature's face. Wonder if it gets headaches. Wonder how it nurses them with only those delicate fins. At that pressure, probably it hears you, is cheered by your concern. Probably that's why it swims out of the nature dock you watched too late last night, hopped up on cold medicine and international news. When it schools beside you on the long walk to work, you tell it, look, this isn't your realm, you don't belong here. Then track its flash of fangs, wending slowly through empty tree branches, bike racks like flora from a depth far more shallow than its species is supposed to go. I've gotten by in stranger places, it tells you. I'm not like those poor bastards that only surface to die. Besides, you're managing the trick of it pretty well yourself. I'm a mammal, you explain. That's what we do. Except it only takes one of its wide, weary side eyes peeking over a signpost to make you break, confessing fine. But you've seen the state of things, right? Maybe it is a wonder that these lungs are still filtering anything too. Maybe it's envy more than fear when I'm watching you flap in the water, top-heavy and brooding, between being prey, yes, all 6 inches of you, and seizing it. We have mouths too, you know, and just look how we use them. Oh, but what I could do with a set of teeth fierce enough to catch on to something more substantial in the murk of this world and hold on.
That was M.L. Clark, once again, with our prompt for the week. That was her poem, Fangtooth Fever Dream. And M.L. Clark, I pulled this bio from a website somewhere, but M.L. Clark is a Canadian expat, writer, educator, and reviewer of speculative fictions, living quite happily in Medellin, Colombia. You can also find a bunch of her poems on Rattle, like I mentioned before, maybe 4. An excellent poet. We've known her for a long time, so it's really cool to see her do that poem. Thanks so much, M.L. Clark. I have a few more poems that I'm going to read for you myself. Now, we had about a dozen people this time submit poems, so I'm not going to be able to read every poem every episode or share. If you send audio, you're pretty likely I'll play it. But I'll read a few more for people who didn't send audio too. But I can't do everyone because it's going to take too long. But there's still 20 people watching live, so you're enjoying this. I'm enjoying this too. You know, I love poetry no more than I love it during the Rattlecast, and I hope you feel that way too. This is Chris Beaver, another poet that we've published. This is her poem for the prompt. This is Ode to the Fangtooth. Blackberryciform, 6-inch nocturnal carnivore, fanged jaw-dropper of the fathoms, like so many fears, you are as harmless to humans as a bad dream. When you surface from 6,000 feet in the middle of night, who remembers the terror of such a tiny nightmare? It's another great poem. Chris Beaver's a poet living in Kirkland, Washington, and her poem, Some of My Best Friends, was in Poets Respond last June. That's Chris Beaver. And that was her Ode to the Fangtooth. A really excellent poem we got this week. And next up, this is Sean Hines, and this is The Creature of the Deep. And I don't know anything about Sean Hines. I couldn't find anything on the internet. He's never submitted to Rattle before, although he's on Facebook a lot. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. If you send these, please do try to send me like a couple, just a sentence bio, where you are, if you've published anything, if you have like a social media presence, you know, a Twitter account or something we can direct people to. That'd be good. But it's not necessary if you don't want to. So Sean Hines, I don't know anything about him, but this is The Creature of the Deep. Buried, deeper than light can penetrate, under more pressure than any man can withstand, the creature of the deep roams wild, spreading terror like fire raining down from heaven. Nothing is safe. Eyes have not seen the nightmarish monster and survive to tell the story. It lurches from the dark, feeds, then dives to the deep, dark pits of hell. That was Sean Hines, Creature of the Deep. How many more do we have? I think we have 2 more that I printed out. This is Jenny Middleton's The Dive. Surging, folding and falling, line upon line, catching the light less. The camera sinks lower as the saline dark gathers and sucks away the source of skies to the murk of drawing tides. The lens locks focus on a jigsaw of spines and filmy eyes peeling with vacancy. Fins spasm and swim, apostrophes shaped to the jellied bloat of a predator glowering in a hush and sway of cells. Teeth protrude, their drilled line, an opening picket as tentacles of flesh give succor, and loomed gulps, its identity no longer certain and eroded as the bitten land above. And that was The Dive by Jenny Middleton. Jenny Middleton's a poet living in the United Kingdom, and thanks so much for sharing that, Jenny. Another excellent poem. It's so cool that these poems wouldn't have existed if we didn't do a prompt. I always love stuff like that. I also think too that when I was in high school, my least favorite thing to do was read out loud in class. I hated when the teacher would call on me, and now that's like my job. I don't know how the world works like that. Okay, I think this is the last. This is the last one. Oh, we have two more actually. So two more quick fang-tooth poems. This is Xavier Pimentel, The Fang-Tooth. Found only in the depths of the deep lies a horrid animal known to man with teeth as long as its body as it swims as deep as it can. The fang-tooth swims with patience for the incoming of its prey, open and laying in wait as if it were going to say, I have you in my clutches, you only need enter in, then will you be made whole. But torn from limb, there's a monster in the deep depths who lies in wait. It eats with a wet hunger, only its prey can sedate. And Xavier Pimentel is an inspiring poet, aspiring LGBT poet from Spring, Texas. He strives to write daily and whenever he has the free time to do so. So that's perfect. If you send something like Xavier did, and a little, just 2-sentence bio, so we can have something to share. And here's the last one for the prompt today. This is Mark Grenier, Fang-Tooth. Gaping maw, scimitars for teeth, black on black, with an angle, a dangle, fearsome indeed, dark angel, fluorescent in part, darker than night, where stars share light. I like that ending. That was Mark Grenier. And Mark Grenier received a PhD in English and American Literature from UC Riverside. He's particularly interested in the roles of poetry and poets in modern society and in the use of scientific and natural scenes or images as vehicles for understanding our place in the modern world. So those were the ones that we pulled out from open mic at rattle.com. I pulled it off submittable for the open mic. I wanted it to be a lot less formal. Like submittable, like accepting and declining felt kind of wrong. If you want the potential to have something read here, just shoot it over email, openmic at rattle.com. If I'm going to read it, I'll let you know. If I don't reply, it's just because there's too many, but I'll try to do as many as I can every episode in a way that makes sense. Now, for next week, and somebody asked where we'd post these, so we're going to read the prompt for the next week at the end of every episode like this. We're also going to put it in the show notes everywhere it is. So if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the notes there after the show. If you're watching on Facebook, if you're watching on iTunes or something, you probably won't even see the notes, but if you do click on there, it'll be there. So that's where it'll be. This is next week's prompt. This is Megan's prompt for next week. The stuntman walks home from work. Must reference a Shakespearean work, either within the poem or in an epigraph. So the stuntman walks home from work. I don't know if we just watched, we kind of watch a movie about once a week, and we watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So I wonder if that's where that comes from, but that's the prompt for the week. So I hope you enjoy writing a poem for that. Let's see. Nobody's asked to be on the Skype open mic. So we have one pre-recorded poem to close it out. But let me say one last time, if you'd like to call me up and read something, if you submitted a prompt poem but I didn't get to it in time, you got to do it by Monday, because then I can pull out stuff and gather the show notes for the week. So if you submit it by Monday, I'll try to get on the show if there's room. I'll try to mix the people up every time if we have more people that can fit. But if you have a poem that you didn't get to me and you want to share it, you can give me a call. Once again, the number is 818-850-7727. You could send a Skype chat message to Rattle Poetry, or just for next week, email openmic@rattle.com. Okay, so to close out the show today, I think, because I don't know if my Skype froze, maybe. Hopefully not. It's been freezing a little bit lately. But to close out the show, we have one more pre-recorded open mic. This is a holdover from when I was doing it on Submittable. And this is A Love Story for All Seasons by Sally Jo. And let me just pull up her. Sally Jo is a technical writer by trade, but enjoys all kinds of writing. She publishes her shorter works on Instagram under Sally Jo Poetry. Her first collection of poetry, Droplets of Four Sisters, was inspired by her younger sisters. So here's her poem that she sent about a month ago, I think, over Submittable, along with the audio. This is A Love Story for All Seasons. And this will close us out for tonight, I think.
Hi, everyone. This is Sally Jo, and I'm recording in Colorado. I'm going to read one of my poems that was published in Rise, an anthology of change, which was edited by Northern Colorado writers. The poem I'm reading is A Love Story for All Seasons. Spring and summer fell in love, much to the surprise of the stars above. He filled the air with blossoms for her. Her heated kiss made his lifeblood stir. But her warmth and exuberance became too much. He withered away under her firm touch. Then an older summer fell in love with fall. They thought each other best of all. Their feminine curves soon blended together. They flirted with heat and with cooler weather. But fall was needy and smothered her lover. Her cool embrace caused the death of summer. Then love between fall and winter came. She donned her bright colors, he whispered her name. He threaded his fingers of frost in her hair. She shivered for him as he stripped her bare. But he was too cold to hold on to her heart. Soon his freezing touch caused her soul to depart. Then slowly winter fell in love with spring. Spring's warming body made winter's blood sing. Their masculine energy played across the land. They worshipped each other, didn't understand. Spring's heat was melting winter's frozen soul. He disappeared slowly as spring became whole. Then again, to the shock of the stars up above, spring and summer fell in love. Thanks, everyone.
So that was Sally Jo. Thanks so much for sharing that, Sally. A personification of the seasons. A nice poem to end on. Hope you enjoyed the show today. As always, it's been a lot of fun for me. This is one of my favorite things of the week. It makes me fall in love with poetry all over again every time you do this. If you feel the same way and you enjoy these shows, please do click the like button and share. Tell your friends to watch, because the more people who watch, the more people who get it thrust in front of them with the way that algorithms and things work, no matter what platform you're on, YouTube or iTunes, or give it 4 stars or 5 stars, whatever the best is over there. Share it on Facebook, all that stuff, because interacting tells the computer that you care about it and other people might too. And that's the way to get poetry spread around the world, rather than complaining about politics. So I hope you have a great week. Next week we have Christina Olson. This is going to be a good one. Well, it's always going to be a good one. But Christina Olson is the author of The Last Mastodon. And that's last year's one of our 3 Chapbook Prize winners last year. The Last Mastodon's a book about the Western Science Center, which is in Hemet, California, not too far down the road from me. And it's a poem about, slavery and human ownership and fossils and science. And I love it because those are things that I find very fascinating. It's a really moving and interesting book. So, and Christina is a really interesting person too. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know her. That is next week, Tuesday, February 11th at 9 p.m. Eastern. Hope to see you then. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week. Good night.